So hi again everyone, welcome back to another video here at CaribScope, and I am thrilled to do this video today. Believe it or not, I'm going to leave the Hebrew Israelites out of this for today. At least I think I will. So I'm going to give you guys a break, okay? Yeah, I kind of deviated off the mission of this channel, which is to talk about the Caribbean by talking about the Hebrew Israelites. And I'm sure those guys are still out there. Some of them are probably still fuming. What's this guy talking about? Some of them are probably out there saying, this idiot. But I thank those of you who have contributed so far, and those of you who've responded to those videos that I did, and I'm sure I'll get back to them again. But for today, I'm going to go to something that's going to be a little bit more personal, a little bit more intimate. And as you know, I do these videos more in a storytelling format. And I hope you appreciate when I do it like that, kind of like mix it up. And I mean, I know all the graphics and everything would be nice, but this is just me speaking to you guys heart to heart, you know, mind to mind. No graphics to distract you or anything like that. You just see my face. I'm just doing the talking, and you guys can take it from there. Okay? Well, today I want to talk about something that's a little bit more family related, and this is going to be about the Caribbean. About my Caribbean family, and about a particular island that people may not necessarily associate with the Caribbean, and it's not even in the Caribbean, but it has a rich connection to the Caribbean. And I think some Caribbean people are not exactly aware as to the wide scope of, I would not use the word influence, but the wide scope of presence that this island generated in the Caribbean. So let me see where I should start to make this interesting to you guys. Let me go this way. So I grew up on the island of St. Kitts. That's where I was raised. You may have heard me mention that here and there. I was raised there because that is where my father is from. Okay? I was raised with my father's family, not my mother's family. My mother is from next door on an island known as Nevis, which is famous for being the birthplace of the parents of the late actress Cicely Tyson. And it's also the birthplace of the grandparents of the celebrity astrophysicist Neil deGrasse Tyson. And it is also known as the birthplace of Alexander Hamilton, of the Hamilton play on Broadway, one of the quote-unquote founding fathers of the United States. Little tiny Nevis, that's where my mother's from. Some people would say Nevis, but, you know, we Caribbean folks call it Nevis. So my father's from St. Kitts, my mother is from Nevis, okay? But I was raised on the island of St. Kitts. So when I went there, I was growing up with my father's mother. And there was something about her that, as a little boy, didn't really pay attention to, didn't really notice. All I know is she was just a grandmother like all the other grandmothers in the neighborhood. She spoke like everybody else. She lived like everybody else. She talked like everybody else. Her mannerisms were like all the people in the local community. But it was when I got older, and when I say older, I was with her for the first 8 years of my life. You know, so I was born on the island of St. Thomas in the U.S. Virgin Islands. That's where I was born. But I was sent to live with her when I was about 6 months old. So I was there with her until I was 8. It was pretty much only after I left St. Kitts and moved to New York City, and then I moved back to St. Thomas. You know, I would run into people who would know, well, who would find out that I grew up in St. Kitts. And of course, you know, the question would be, where are you from in St. Kitts? Where are your people from? And I would go ahead and I would tell them. And for those people who might be familiar with where I was from, they would say something to me. They would ask me a question. Wait a minute. Your grandmother is the white lady from down the street? And I'd be like, yeah, the white lady, yeah. And something I didn't really, you know, describe her as growing up. It was just my grandmother. And they're saying the white lady down the street. I'm like, the white lady? Yeah, I guess she was, you know, because now I'm living in the United States. Now I'm understanding this whole obsession with white and black and whatever. So I'm like, well, yeah, she's the white lady down the street. That's my grandmother. So at the time I had left her, you know, we lived apart. She was living in St. Kitts. I was living in New York City at that time. Then I eventually moved to Florida. And so we lived apart. And there were a couple of times we kind of met up because I would go home to St. Thomas and she was there and whatever. I was not too curious to find out anything about my family heritage or family roots or whatever at the time, so I was not really paying much attention to ask the pertinent questions, the relevant questions, questions I wish I had asked back then. Fast forward to the year 2007, on my birthday, my grandmother passed away. When she passed away, all of a sudden, it sort of hit me like, I don't know anything about her. I just knew she was my grandmother. I didn't know anything beyond her. I didn't know anything about her parents. In passing, I heard something about her father and whatever, but she never really grew up with him. So I didn't know much about her. So, I'm at an age now where I'm starting to get a little curious about who I am, where I come from, what's going on, who's who, what's what. So on both sides of my family, I really did not know much beyond my grandparents. So when my grandmother passed away, I decided to do a little search and try to find out, more about her. And this took me on an interesting journey. So to skip over a long portion here, a first cousin of my father, a first cousin that my father does not even know. They've never spoken. And the first cousin who does not really know my father. They have never spoken, like I mentioned. But he is a first cousin, so he'll be my second cousin. So he's older than I am. So he was also on this quest to find out more about family, but he was further ahead in the game than I was. Well, just by chance, on Ancestry.com, he saw me asking a question. He didn't know me, he doesn't know me, but because I mentioned my grandmother's name and he recognized the name because my grandmother is his aunt. But he also did not really know my grandmother. Ironically, they were born in the same island, St. Kitts. He grew up knowing of my grandmother, his mother's sister. But for some reason back then, they were not allowed to be associating with my grandmother. And the reason for this, you're talking about years and years ago, my grandmother was the second or third child of my great-grandfather, of her father. And my grandmother, I think, was born outside, if you know what that means. Was probably born to a mistress. So my grandmother was more or less kind of like rejected, left out, shoved on the side over there somewhere. And as a result, I think my grandmother harbored some resentment or just didn't grow up around her father. But this first cousin of my father happened to know of her, at least he knew her name, didn't know much more about her. So he comes in and he realizes I'm trying to find out more about my grandmother. He says, well, while I might not know a lot about your grandmother, her mother, who is my sister, I know more about her. And I know a little bit more about the family history. So I'm like, hey, go ahead and tell me what that is. He says, your grandmother, her grandmother, in other words, her father's mother, came from Madeira. When he said that, I am a geography geek. I can pretty much tell you this about where any place in the world is. Even if you name a capital, I might not be able to identify the country, but I might be able to tell you where in the world that capital might be. And if you mention a country, I'm better at that by telling you what location that may be in. But when he said Madeira, for some reason, it just didn't register in my head to go looking, because he said Madeira and he mentioned Portugal. But when he said Madeira, Portugal, I just assumed that Madeira was a province, a district, a town, a city on mainland Portugal. So I just said, okay, I know where Portugal is. I know all about Portugal. I know their history. I know the notorious part. I know the good part, all that good stuff. Being a geography buff. So some years go by. I just figured Madeira, Portugal. Didn't pay much attention to it at the time. But then it reminded me of an uncle of mine. That's my grandmother's or my father's younger brother. Same grandmother, her son. And he said something in passing one time when I was younger. I want to say I was probably like in my late teens, early 20s, when I had moved to New York City after I graduated from high school. That uncle was living in New York, and just in passing, he just happened to say, "Hey, you know, Mama's people." That's what we call my grandmother. That's what he called his mother, and that's what I call my grandmother, his mother. So he would say, "You know, Mama's people came from Portugal," and he said it to me. I was like, "Oh, okay, that's nice." Just didn't really put much stock into it. Just didn't invest my mind into it too much. You know, I was still emerging as a person who was into geography, a person who was into history. So fast forward now, all these years later, after this cousin now mentions this information to me. But still, it did not really resonate with me. It's like, oh, Madeira, Portugal. Okay, didn't really think much of it, you know, because I figured, like, what would I know? I mean, I probably wouldn't find out any more information anyway, so I wasn't pursuing anything. But then I got to meet my wife. And in between meeting my wife and finding out this information, on my mother's side, my mother, I said, "Mom, I don't know much about your father," because again, my mother also did not grow up with her father. So I said, "I don't know much about your father. You know, I don't know much about his family." And my mother was like, "I don't really know much either." But she pointed me to some people who would know some more. And I'll get back to that in a minute. That's my mother's side now. But I eventually met my wife. And my wife is from the country of Guyana. So on one of my, I think it was on my second trip to Guyana, this is before we got married because that's where my wife was living. I go down and I meet her mother's mother, so her maternal grandmother. So I meet her. So she took me to meet the family, which is a good thing because this tells me at least she figured that, hey, this guy's worth showing to my family. So I meet her grandmother and we were talking, having a conversation. Just put my finger all over my glasses. So we were having this conversation, and my wife is one of the more attractive women in the world. I don't even know what this woman even saw in me, but she is just extremely attractive. You know, she has an exotic look to her, you know. And I know when people think of Guyana, you tend to think of people who are more of East Indian heritage. She doesn't look all like that. Put it this way, she looks more like Halle Berry, okay? So, we were talking, and her grandmother was very forthcoming with information. So, you know, she was telling me about the family and all this good stuff. And ironically, one of her brothers is the nephew of Kwame Nkrumah, the first president of Ghana. Ghana, right? Yeah, Ghana, not Kenya. So, he's a nephew of, because I think Nkrumah's brother was part of the British Navy or whatever, and back in those days, Guyana, as we know it today, was known as British Guyana, and I guess he went on a ship down there, whatever, and I guess he met, you know, a local woman, and she produced one of the brothers of, or I think it's one of the brothers of her grandmother, my wife's grandmother. But anyway, that aside, so we were talking, and then my wife's grandmother blurted out something. So we were just talking, and she was just like, "Yes, and my father's a Portuguese. And in Guyana and in St. Kitts, when you say Portuguese, it means Portuguese." And she said Portuguese. She said, "My grandfather, his father, came from Madeira." I said, "Madeira?" And when she said that, she said it as if I should know where Madeira was, and I'm like thinking. I said, why don't they say Portugal? Why is it always Madeira? Like, what's going on, you know? So I'm like, that's interesting that you should say that, because I found out just a few years ago that's where my grandmother, who raised me, her grandmother came from. So this got me really curious. I said, Madeira, let me go look up this place. I go looking, and first thing I notice, it's an island. It's not a part of mainland Portugal. It's an island off the coast of Morocco, believe it or not, just above the Canary Islands. And I'm like, oh, that's interesting. So I got a little bit more curious. It's an island. It's not a part of mainland Portugal. That's interesting. So I said, okay, that's my family up in St. Kitts with a Madeiran connection. Here's my wife's, well, she was going to be my wife. Here's my wife's family in Guyana with a Madeiran connection. And I started to look into this a little bit more, and I was just like, this is interesting. So then I started to do some research. And when I started doing the research, especially by someone by the name of Joanne Ferreira, you might want to look her up. She's pretty much an authority on this whole Madeira Caribbean connection. So giving her a plug, I think her name is Joanne Ferreira. And Ferreira being, believe it or not, a Portuguese last name. But she was born on the island of Trinidad. So I'm here thinking, what does that island have to do with these islands? Because here is something interesting. I went to school with people with Portuguese last names, but it never dawned on me to notice something. The Portuguese never colonized anywhere in the Caribbean. The only place they colonized on this side of the world was Brazil. Now, there were Portuguese explorers who came over to the Caribbean. There were Portuguese people who came to the Caribbean way back in the early age of discovery, and many of them were Jews who were escaping persecution from places in Iberia, such as Spain and Portugal, which are the two countries, well, if you include Andorra, which make up the peninsula of Iberia. So they were fleeing persecution. So when the first early explorers came to this side of the world, they decided, hey, I'm going to jump on the boat. What do I have to lose? I'm going to jump on the boat with Columbus. I'm going to jump on the boat with this guy, that guy. And they were some of the early pioneers. Those were some of the Portuguese that made it to the Caribbean. But there weren't any official Portuguese colonization that was authorized by the crown in Portugal to go and colonize Jamaica, go and colonize Haiti. There was nothing like that. The Portuguese were found nowhere in the Caribbean in terms of colonization. But why do all these people I know growing up or looking through a phone book or whatever, I'm seeing all these Portuguese last names? Never dawned on me back then that these people with these Portuguese last names are not descendants, just like I am, are not descendants of Portuguese conquerors, Portuguese slavers, Portuguese exploiters. They weren't. These were people that came to the Caribbean for an entirely different reason, and there's some irony to it. While Brazil, which had eventually broken away from Portugal and become its independent place, and that Portugal was still supplying enslaved Africans to Brazil, using Portuguese ships and whatever. The Madeirans, around the same time, were making their way to the Caribbean. Now, why would Portuguese people from the island of Madeira be making their way to the Caribbean? What was going on? Here's the interesting part. In 1834, England ended slavery in its empire. And most of that slavery was taking place in its British Caribbean colonies: Jamaica, St. Vincent, St. Kitts, Nevis, Antigua, Trinidad, Grenada, Dominica, St. Lucia, Guyana, or British Guyana, or Demerara back then. So when they ended slavery, the planters who benefited from this, the oppressors, the quote-unquote slave masters who benefited from this, who were very wealthy and very influential at the time, they were upset. Hey, they went to Parliament, the British government, you're ending slavery. Do you know you're taking money out of our pockets? Do you know how powerful we are? You better fix this. So the British government now scrambling around, like, okay, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? Portugal and England at the time had a long-running peace treaty going back hundreds of years prior that is still intact to this very day. England may have had all of its issues with Spain and France over the years and other places, and even Germany in modern times. The one country they never had a problem with, the one kingdom they never had a problem with, was with Portugal. But during that time, as the British they're ending slavery in their colonies, Madeira and the Azores, which are also part of Portugal, under the Portuguese sovereignty, they were going through some hard economic times. There was also religious tension going on in places like Madeira. So you have poverty going on, illiteracy going on, famines going on in Madeira. So the people are destitute, looking for work, have nothing to do, out on an island, out in the middle of the Caribbean. Their most popular crop that Madeira was known for was wine. But then a blight, a plant disease hit those vineyards, wiping out the industry. And a lot of people at the time were illiterate. And a place like Madeira, which is a beautiful island, but a place like Madeira, it's treacherous. A lot of hills, a lot of jagged peaks and everything. So if you lost that ability, getting from the rural areas to town, which is the capital is known as Funchal, was not a very easy thing to do. So the British, realizing that Portugal has a problem in their hands, Portugal realizing they have a problem in their hands, they have a couple of islands or a few islands out in the Atlantic that are struggling and are wearing and bearing down on their social system. So England comes by and says, hey, look, we can take those people off of your hands. We've got work for them to do in our former British colonies because, hey, the black folks, they don't want to do this stuff anymore, Like they walked off the plantations. They don't want to do this backbreaking stuff for free anymore. They're free now, so now they can call their shots, So the British went to Portugal and said, we can take those Madeirans off your hands. Those Azorians, we can take them off your hands. So Portugal encouraged people from these islands to take the opportunity to go to the Caribbean, the British Caribbean colonies, to work there in the cane fields. Initially, there was hesitancy. But by the 1860s, I want to say 60,000 or somewhere in that number up there, eventually made their way to the British colonies in the Caribbean. The lion's share of them going to Demerara, which was part of British Guyana back then, which is today Guyana, and a lot of them also went to Trinidad, and then to the smaller islands, a sprinkling of a few that went to the other islands. Well, on those other islands, that's where my grandparents come from. So my great-grandmother, my great-great-grandmother, my father's mother's grandmother, she made her way to the island of St. Kitts. I don't know much about her. All I knew is that she had 2 children. Well, she married a gentleman on the island of St. Kitts. He was from the island of St. Bart, so he was French. So St. Barthélemy is an island not too far away from St. Kitts, and I guess he was living on St. Kitts at the time, or he himself had immigrated to St. Kitts because St. Barthélemy was having its own problems because they had a hurricane that destroyed a whole lot of stuff, and a whole lot of people from the island of St. Barthélemy ended up going to the island where I was born, St. Thomas. But I guess some of them moved to some closer islands like St. Kitts. So she married this Portuguese woman, this Madeiran woman, coming over to the island of St. Kitts looking for opportunity, married this Frenchman, and they produced a child. They produced 2 children. The second child was a son, and that child turned out to be my grandmother's father. There is the Madeiran connection. So when I found out all of this, I was like, wow. So just remember, that was just my great-great-grandmother, but there were thousands of others who also made it over to this side of the world. They didn't come with swords. They didn't come with people that they enslaved. They didn't come over to enslave anybody. They didn't come over to exploit anybody. These were poor, destitute, a lot of them were illiterate people who found themselves in the Caribbean looking for a better opportunity. The same Caribbean where just a few years before there were Africans and their descendants who were in chains and enslaved. Ironically, something that started, if you're talking about this side of the world, with the very Portuguese and their start of the transatlantic slave trade. How is that for irony? So they come over. Remember, these people are from an island. That island, Madeira, was actually a colony. So you can look at it by saying Madeira was, yes, it was part of Portugal, but just keep in mind it was also a colony. It was also an island that's being exploited by the mother country, just like the other islands in the Caribbean, for its benefit. Okay? So these Madeirans come over, and in that number, it's my great-great-grandmother. My wife's great-great-grandfather, he came over in 1901 from the island of Madeira. Has an interesting last name. because his last name is hyphenated. One half of the hyphenated name is Italian, and the other part is Portuguese. I'll try to see if I can get to that in a minute, okay? If I can get back to it. On my mother's side, same scenario, same story happened. I know a little bit less about the patriarch, the Madeiran patriarch of our family on that side. I know a lot more about what came after, but not what was going on with him. Because his story is just wild and crazy. Changed his last name to an English last name like Marshall, but he used Marshall at times, and then he flipped it over to De Costa at other times, which is also a Portuguese last name. On my grandmother's side, over on my father's side, her great-grandmother's name was Maria de Jesus, or de Jesus, something like that. I guess how the Portuguese pronounce it. So again, Portuguese last names. But for the life of me, I just did not know any of this at all. None of this at all. But with my wife now, it's a little bit different. So, for our 5th wedding anniversary, I told my wife, I said, you know what? Let's be daring. We now realize that we have a connection to this island over here called Madeira, an island I had never heard of before. I may have heard about it in passing and never paid much attention to it. Again, I just heard the name Madeira. I thought it was a part of it is a part of Portugal, but not mainland. It's just like Hawaii to the United States, but I just did not know it was not on the mainland. It was an island by itself. So for our 5th wedding anniversary, I told my wife, let's be daring. Let's not go to Cancun or the Dominican Republic or places nearby or wherever. I'm from the Caribbean. We know the blue waters. We've seen all of that before. Why don't we do something different and go to this island known as Madeira? We don't know anybody. Don't know what's going on. But when I made that decision, I decided to also go ahead and do my ancestry DNA. And I said, I'm going to do this DNA because I want to see how much of this oral history actually turns out to be true. So I go ahead and I do my ancestry, my DNA, and when I did my DNA, it comes back. Of course, shows me majority African, right? I think it was like 43% or something like that Nigerian, the rest of it Benin, and then it starts trickling down to Cameroon and a few other places. But once it leaves Africa, the next thing that pops up is Portugal. Like, wow, Portugal. So I guess the elders were telling the truth. They weren't making something up or pulling something out of their behinds. They were actually telling the truth. That was before it was edited to now where it shows that 18% of my ancestry, or my DNA, that's a pretty large chunk, comes from Portugal. My wife later on now, she goes ahead and does her DNA. Mine just says Portugal. It looks like it kind of specifies to some degree Madeira and then to some degree the Azores. My wife, on the other hand, her results actually specifies Madeira as to where her DNA comes from. And if you think about it, we're not talking about too far back. In terms of history, my wife's great-grandfather came from Madeira because, and how we know this is because his actual record of his filing for his papers to travel to the Caribbean, his actual paperwork, his name, where he comes from in Madeira, and when he traveled, is actually on file. And he traveled to Demerara, as we call Guyana today. He traveled there in 1901. 1901 was when he traveled down there. You see his name. I was not that lucky with mine because my family went down there a little bit earlier and the history is a little bit more crazy and wild, And with a name like Maria de Jesus, it's very hard to pin that down because that's like looking for Mary Smith in England. There's a lot of, I would have to go through thousands of records to find her. I don't know when she was born necessarily. I don't know where she was born in Madeira, so it's very hard to track her down, so I'm still in search mode right now. So that was something that was truly fascinating to me and something to have found out. So my wife and I decided, let's go to this island. In 2022, we decided to go to this island. Never been to Europe before, never been on that side of the Atlantic before, but decided we're going to go. Fortunately for us, just before we were about to go, I decided to go ahead and visit a couple of Portuguese pages, but more Madeira specific. And while I'm out there, the fortunate thing was, if I had put out Maria de Jesus, it's going to be again needle in a haystack. But my wife's great-grandfather's last name was Doria Teixeira. Doria is the Italian part. Teixeira is the Portuguese part. So when I saw that, I put that name out there and asked the Madeirans, do you recognize the surname? Well, it's a unique surname for Madeira, so being that it was unique, a couple of people jumped out of the woodwork, one particular person, and said, I am a Doria Teixeira. And I was like, oh. We come to find out now that that person who came and made themselves known to me, or to us, on Facebook that person, his great-great-grandfather, I believe, and my wife's great-great-grandfather were actually siblings. If they were not siblings, it was uncle, nephew, or cousins, but I think they were siblings. One, my wife's great-great-grandfather, was the bold one to take that move and make that move and travel to the British Caribbean to look for a better life, where that other brother stayed, I'm sure he had other siblings, stayed in Madeira and started his own family line. Through the craziest of things, people we never knew, they never knew we existed, I never knew they existed, my wife did not know they exist, come to find out that this person is actually her cousin. And after we saw that, we were like, oh. So we felt a little bit more encouraged by going, because we get there, he meets us, and most generous, most hospitable person that we can think of, that actually showed us a good time while we were there, even loaned us his car, his Alfa Romero, never knew who we were. And it's like, here, you can have the car, guys can go wherever you want to go, unless you want me to take you, but you guys can have it. I thought that was really interesting. But we go there, and this island is just amazingly beautiful. They call it the Hawaii of Europe. It does have a look like that, but it also has a look like St. Kitts, where I was raised. So when I got there, it resonated with me. We flew into mainland Portugal, so I did see Lisbon, I did see parts of Portugal while I was there, mainland Portugal. But when I got to Madeira, I felt like I was going home. I felt like I was back in St. Kitts. The landscape, the beauty, clean, safe, pleasant people, great food, which surprised me, and I was just like, wow, just blown away. My wife and I were just moved. But when we landed, my wife's cousin, the same one I just mentioned, took my wife to the family land on the northeastern side of Madeira, and basically said, all this land that you see here before you, this land belonged to our family. And just to give you a quick little history on that, when Madeira was discovered, because there's no record that there were people living on the island when the Portuguese showed up in 1419. No record of that. And I'm sure if there were, we would have heard about it, because we all know what was going on back then. We got to enslave folks. We got to exploit folks. But there's no record that there were people living on the islands. Could it have been people passing through, but there was no static society on the island at the time. But when the Portuguese showed up in 1419, the Portuguese now, on the mainland, they wanted to colonize the island. So they sent a bunch of people from jail, Jews who escaped the persecution from the mainland. They went over there, and eventually there were people who came in from islands like Malta, because the Portuguese used the island as an experimental place to grow sugarcane and start the plantation system on that island, that was then transported over to the New World in Brazil. So Madeira was used as like the template. So there were people who came from the island of Malta, because apparently they were experts on sugarcane production. But another group of people also came through, and they were Genoese merchants who left Genoa when Genoa and Venice was kind of like waning in power, because they dominated trade for quite some time. But then, as Spain and Portugal began to emerge, they weren't stupid. They looked over and said, that's where the money is at. That's the new game in town. So a lot of these Genoese merchants and Jews, merchants among them, they traveled over to Iberia, Portugal, and Spain. But when Madeira opened up, they also decided to go over there. One family or one member of a prominent family from Italy, the Doraias, Doria, or Doria as the people in Guyana may call it, they decided that they were going to go ahead to this island and be pioneers on this island also. Now, because they had money, because they had wealth, they became one of the more prominent families on the island, the Doria clan. So they eventually got all this land in the northeastern part of Madeira. Now, the Teixeira side, T-E-I-X-E-I-R-A, Teixeira, that side of the family, one of the explorers, one of the Portuguese explorers who discovered the island of Madeira was a Teixeira. His name was Tristão, I think that was his name, Tristão Teixeira. Vaz Tristão Teixeira. He was one of the explorers that came to the island. Somewhere along the line, some daughter or granddaughter or great-granddaughter of his married over into the Teixeira clan. Over into the Doria clan. So two prominent families, a pioneering family from Italy that originated from Genoa, Italy, and a Portuguese family known as Teixeiras, and the names became hyphenated. Think that they produced two lines on the island of Madeira. So my wife comes through that Italian Portuguese mix there because her great-grandfather was still carrying that last surname. As a matter of fact, she found some additional cousins. These are, I think, siblings of her grandmother's father, who still carry the Doria last name. That's their last name, D-O-R-I-A. The Teixeira side has been dropped for some reason. So, knowing all of this and finding all of this out was really a fascinating history, something for us to know. So it's not just us alone. You go to Guyana, there's a bunch of people. You will see Portuguese surnames around. Silveira, Fernandes, not Fernandez, but Fernandes. You will see names like, you see Teixeira. Mark Teixeira, the former baseball player for the New York Yankees. His parents, at least his father, I think both of them, actually come from the country of Guyana, well, formerly British Guyana. You might see him, I mean, I think about that, but that's where his family come from, Portuguese last name. So there's a bunch of Portuguese last names that you can find in St. Kitts, you can find them in Nevis, you can find them in Antigua, you can find them in St. Vincent, you can find them in Trinidad, you can find them in Guyana. Portuguese last names. But when you see the Portuguese last names, a lot of those people are actually descendants of people from Madeira specifically. And I guess to a lesser extent the Azores. Just keep in mind, because I know it's very easy for people to come in here like, the Portuguese, I don't have nothing to do with them. Do you know what they did? Yes, we can get all over that. I am fully aware of the Portuguese hand in starting the transatlantic slave trade. I give them some credit, though. You know when you look at someone and it's like you don't like the game is dirty what they're doing, but you got to respect the game. Small little country like that, small little country, was able to spread its wings and dominate huge chunks of the globe at one point in time, or control trade. Spain, England. Look, I don't like what they did. I really don't. But gotta respect their game, It was a world of conquer or be conquered, and they just happened to be the ones conquering. But aside from all that, because that's a whole other story, I look back and I must say that this has really been a fascinating history for me to have learned, to have found out about myself. Just by growing up in the Caribbean, I always was associated with anything Africa. And generally when we think of any of us with white in our family, We tend to think only of, well, I only had a white great great grandfather because he raped my black grandmother and it was in slavery and raping was going on, and that was a tragic reality of things going on back then. And it may have happened in my family further back. But when it comes to the Portuguese side that popped up in my family, none of that was going on. These were, again, destitute, poor people that came to the islands with no power, nothing whatsoever. In both cases, my wife and mine, they married into the local population, married local people on those islands, whether it be St. Kitts or Nevis, or whether it be down in Guyana. And they had children. And as far as I know, none of the people I mentioned ever moved back to Madeira. So they set up shop on these new places where they ended up living. They never went back to Madeira, which is one of the reasons why I think some of the knowledge got cut off, which is why I had to rediscover all of this, because it wasn't like they were going, this was not a world where you traveled 3,000 miles across the sea and went home every summer to see your parents. You went, and a lot of times that was it. You stayed where you were. You started families where you were. You assimilated where you were. So it wasn't like they were going back and forth and going back on trips and, hey kids, we're going to go home to see your grandparents in Madeira next week. It wasn't that kind of world. But again, I would say it's really been fascinating to find this out. And if you happen to be a person from the Caribbean with a Portuguese last name, and there are people who don't even have a Portuguese last name, but one of the most common things that I hear, like when I bring this topic up to other people in the Caribbean, especially in St. Kitts, first thing you'll hear, yeah, somebody told me that my grandmother was from Portugal, or I heard something about Portugal in my family. It is more common than people think. The presence of the Madeiran name, or their presence, it may be either hidden, not talked about much. Like when you go to a place like British Guiana, there's a lot of talk about the East Indians because they're there. You could see the East Indian heritage. The African side, you can see it, they're there. And the Portuguese seem to be lurking in the shadow. That presence of the Portuguese just happens to be lurking in the shadows. Yes, a lot of Portuguese did leave Guyana in the early 1970s when Forbes Burnham became president, or 60s, or whenever he became president. A lot of them fled because there was some conflict there. But you just see the Portuguese name and presence in the names alone. You see it there. Sometimes there's some foods that people are eating, not even realizing that it had to do with the Portuguese. And the interesting thing about the Madeirans were like the Chinese of the day. It was not just the Caribbean. Madeirans also ended up in the United States in places like California, Indiana, Hawaii, because a lot of them went there to work on the pineapple plantations over in Hawaii. You go over there, you find all that stuff. The ukulele, that seems to be so synonymous with a place like Hawaii, is actually an instrument that actually came from these Madeirans who brought that instrument over to Hawaii. But now when you see it, you see them playing the little Hawaii, ala, hey, you tend to think of that as being Hawaiian. It's actually the Portuguese, the Madeirans, who actually brought that there. So they spread out. They went to South Africa. They went to Australia. Because remember, because of all the economic craziness that was going on back then, a lot of them just fled the island, just looking for a better life. And a lot of them never made it back, started their own families. So there's a lot of people who are of Madeiran heritage living in Hawaii or living in South Africa, who may not even know about their families back in Madeira who stayed behind. So this is what I wanted to talk to you guys about today. So if you happen to be a person from the Caribbean with Portuguese, Madeiran specifically, or Azorean association, and you found this out, or you've discovered this, or you're going to, hey, let me go ask my grandmother, let me go ask my grandfather, and you get any information, let's come back in the comment section and talk about it. I think it will be something fascinating to talk about. So the Hebrew Israelites today, I didn't bother you guys too much. Some of you may come in here, I don't want to hear nothing about a white man. I don't want to hear nothing about no Portugal. I know it's kind of hard to kind of separate, as I said before, I could do a whole video on the Portuguese and their hands in the transatlantic slave trade and all the craziness that they did. But this is a different side of the story. And of course, the land of Madeira, the land of Portugal, didn't do me anything. So if I want to go there and enjoy the land, see the beauty of the place, I can go there and do that. And that other thing about, want to burn down the whole place because of what they did to our ancestors, could stay far away from my mind. I can still go there, enjoy the place, and again, kind of have to respect. And when I say respect, I don't mean it like wow, that's something we should do or something we should have done. But again, small little countries, and what they were able to do up to this very day, that their influence is still scattered all around the world in language, food, so many different things. Ever sit back and say, gotta give y'all some credit, Could have been Africans doing that. But you guys got the head start, got the jump. That's what you went ahead and did. But again, that's a whole different story, a whole different video. I'm talking about my big, fat Madeiran family. All right, guys. I'll just leave it at that because I've got to head back here to work. But I just want to drop this video in here for you guys, and I hope you appreciate it. And I would love to hear your comments, and let's talk about it. I would like to hear from you guys who have family who came from Madeira. You know about this, or you're going to find out about it and bring that information back here, okay? So until the next video, thank you again for tuning in. I really appreciate your time. Bye-bye.